King and pawn endings are the building blocks of all other positions, and a single move can be the difference between winning, drawing, or losing a game. In this position, the kings are directly opposing each other, fighting for the key squares c6, d6, and e6. The side that has to move next loses this battle. The side that does not have to move has what is called direct opposition. Opposition is when there is an odd number of squares between the kings, and direct opposition is when the kings are directly facing each other with one square between them. Opposition is all about taking over a key square or preventing your opponent from moving to a key square. In this position, if white has to move, black has the opposition, so that after king c5, black keeps the opposition with king c7, preventing white's king from advancing. On the other hand, if it is black to move, white has the opposition. So if black's king moves to e7, white's king advances to c6, moving to a key square to help the pawn advance up the board and win the game. What happens if there is more than one square between the kings? Does opposition still matter? It does, and we are going to explore the idea of distant opposition. Let's get started. In this position, white plays king e2. In king and pawn endgames, the side with the pawn wants to get the king 2 ranks in front of the pawn. In this case, the key squares are e4, d4, and c4. If black tries to guard all 3 of these squares at once with king d5, white takes direct opposition with king d3. Black's king is forced to give up one of the key squares on the next turn, so white's king will advance 2 ranks in front of the pawn with a winning position. After king e2, black has only one way to draw this game, and that is with distant opposition. Where can black's king move to get on the same file as white's king with an odd number of squares between them? If you found king e6, great job. There is an odd number of squares between the kings, 3 squares, and it is not black's move. This means black has distant opposition. White's only way to make progress is to try and move the king forward, but once white does this, such as by playing king e3, black now takes direct opposition with king e5. White's king can't get 2 ranks in front of the pawn, so black prevents white from making progress and should draw the game. Let's take a look at another example. The main idea behind distant opposition is to turn it into direct opposition. In this position, can you see how white can gain distant opposition? That's right, with king b3. After king b6, white takes direct opposition with king b4. And if king c6, white plays king c4. After king c7, should white keep distant opposition with king e3? White can, but remember that white's goal is to get 2 ranks in front of the pawn. The key squares are 2 squares in front of the pawn, c4, and the other 2 squares to the side, b4 and d4. After king c7, white should play king c4. You might wonder why white would allow black to take direct opposition with king c6. The reason why white wants to be 2 ranks in front of the pawn is so that when black takes opposition, like in this situation, white can simply play c3. White now has the opposition, and black's king is forced to give up one of the key squares. Let's take a look at one more position together. In this position, white is down a pawn and faces a difficult defense. If white tries to quickly grab a pawn after king f3, black wins the game after king d1. Black now has diagonal opposition. After king f4, king e2, king takes f5, black captures white's pawn with king takes e3 and will advance the d-pawn to victory. If white plays king f2, black takes direct opposition with king d2. And after king f3, black plays the waiting move king e1. Notice white's king cannot take direct opposition because the pawn on e3 is in the way. If white plays king f4, then we reach the same winning position for black after king e2. If white plays king g3, black wins again after king e2. The only way to guard the pawn is with king f4. and black now takes direct opposition with king f2. White is forced to give up the pawn and enter the same losing position we looked at earlier. So what is white to do? White can save the game by gaining distant opposition. After king g1, there is an odd number of squares between the kings, and it is not white's move. This means white has distant opposition. If black plays king d2, white takes direct opposition with king f2. After king c2, white keeps the distant opposition with king g2. And after king c3, white continues to shadow the black king using distant opposition with king g3. Amazingly, black cannot make any progress. White will continue to shadow black's king until sooner or later black tries to attack white's pawn with king d3. White can now gain direct opposition with king f3. Black has one last trap after king c2. What should white play? If white plays king e2, black now wins the game because after king c3, white loses the opposition because white cannot play king e3. After king f3, king d3. If king f4, black plays king e2. And if king f2, black plays king d2, returning to positions we already studied when black has a winning endgame. After king c2, white's only move to save the game is by keeping distant opposition with the move king g2. White shadows the king using distant opposition and waits for a moment to take direct opposition. Black cannot make any progress. Now that you've learned how to both win and save positions using distant opposition, let's put your skills to the test. Sometimes you have to take 2 steps back to take 1 step forward. As strange as that may sound, that may be the only way to win certain king and pawn endgames. In this position, white wishes it was black's turn to move because black would be forced to weaken the position. If black plays king to c5, guarding the passed pawn, white would simply play e6 followed by f5, when white's connected passed pawns would force black to give up the c4 pawn and enter a completely losing position. Of course, if black blocks the e5 pawn with king e6, white would simply capture black's pawn. With white to move, what is white to do? White can win the game by using a concept known as triangulation. Triangulation is a king maneuver that loses a tempo, giving your opponent the move. White will triangulate the king using the squares c3, c2, and d2, forming a triangle. White will take 2 steps back to take 1 step forward, losing a key tempo in the process. After king c2, white begins the triangulation plan. If black plays king c5, white uses the same plan we mentioned with e6 and f5. Black's king cannot move forward with king d4, as white's passed pawn would promote after e6. Black's only try is king e6. Since king c3 and king d5 repeats moves, white wastes a move before returning to c3 with king d2. Black cannot plan to capture the f4 pawn because if black captures it, white's passed e-pawn cannot be stopped. Black tries to protect the c4 pawn by playing king d5. After taking 2 steps back, now it's white's turn to take a step forward with king c3. White has triangulated the king, entering the starting position, except this time it is black to move. After losing a tempo, handing the move to black, triangulation has put black into zugzwang. Any move black plays will allow white to make progress and win the game. Let's take a look at another example of triangulation. In this position, white had just moved the king to d1. Before Grandmaster Viktor Korchnoi playing the black pieces made a move, white decided to resign. Why would white do this? White realized that Grandmaster Korchnoi would win the game using triangulation. Let's see why black needs to be careful in this position. If black rushes forward with king d3, after king e1 and e2, it looks like white's king is going to be forced away from the promotion square with an easy win for black. Unfortunately for black, white has the drawing resource g5. After f takes g5 and g4, black is forced to give up the e2 pawn to avoid stalemate, and after king e4, king takes e2, king f4, king f2, king takes g4, king g2, white gains the opposition and should draw the game. Black needs to triangulate the king using the d4, d5, and e5 squares. After king d5, black begins the triangulation plan. If white plays king e2, black will play king e4, taking over opposition, and after the king moves, black will take over the key f3 square, capturing white's pawns. After king e1, black does not move back to d4 when king d1 would repeat the position. The winning move is king e5. Black wastes a move before returning to the d4 square, the key move in triangulation. White now has a choice to move to d1 or f1. If white plays king f1, black completes triangulation with king d4, king e1, king d3, king d1, e2 check, king e1, and king e3. We enter the same position that will lose for white after white's other king move, king d1. Let's take a look. We reach the same position after king d1 and king d4. We have returned to the original position, except this time it is white to move. Let's see why this is important after king e1, king d3, king d1, e2 check, king e1, and king e3. We have reached the critical position. White's king does not have any legal moves and is forced to push the g-pawn. After g5, f takes g5, and g4. Because black's king is on e3, black can now play king f3, forcing king d2, when black wins the game with king f2. Now that you've learned how to win an endgame by losing a move, let's put your triangulation skills to the test. Rook endings are the most common ending in all of chess. Mastering these endgames will allow you to win games that would otherwise be drawn, and drawing games that would be lost. The most important rook ending to first learn is known as the Lucena position. With white to move, we have the basic Lucena position, which is a rook ending where one side has a king in front of its pawn, blocking the promotion square, and the defender only has a rook. How can white win this endgame? White needs to move the king off the promotion square and then promote the pawn, right? It's easier said than done. If white plays rook e7 check, trying to push the black king away, black simply plays king f8, and white isn't making any progress. The only way to force the black king off the f-file and make room for the white king is by playing rook f1 check. If black plays king e6, white wins easily after king e8, followed by promoting the pawn. So black is forced to move to the g-file with king g7. Black's king has been forced away from the action, but white still needs to play carefully. Understanding white's next move is the key to the Lucena position. If white rushes to move the king out of the pawn's way with king e7, white will not have time to promote the pawn because the exposed king will always be attacked by the black rook. After rook e2 check, white's best move is to return the king in front of the pawn, correcting the mistake, and then using the Lucena strategy. If white plays king d6, rook d2 check, king e6, rook e2 check, after king d5, rook d2 check, white's king is forced to protect the d7 pawn, and white isn't making any progress. Since moving the king failed, what can white do? The key move in the Lucena position is playing the rook to the 4th rank with rook f4. What is the idea behind this strange-looking rook move? Notice the rook is 2 ranks away from black's king, so black's king cannot attack it. The main idea is to shield the white king from the rook's checks. Grandmaster Aaron Nimzovich called this strategy building a bridge. After rook c1, king e7. Once the king leaves the protection of the passed pawn, black's rook immediately attacks it with rook e1 check. And after king d6, rook d1 check, white must not rush up the board and forget the protection of the d7 pawn. So white plays king e6. If black doesn't check the king and plays rook d2, white simply plays rook f5, followed by rook d5, shielding the pawn from the rook's attack and promoting the pawn on the next turn. After rook e1 check, king d5, and rook d1 check, we can now appreciate the strength behind white's rook f4 move. After rook d4, white's king is shielded from check, and the bridge has been built. White is ready to promote the pawn on the next turn. After rook f1 check, since king g7 lost to the powerful rook f4 move, what happens if black plays king g6 instead? With the idea of attacking the rook on f4 with king g5. Since the king no longer protects f8, white can win by playing rook f8. White is ready to move the king away from the promotion square when the rook on f8 will support the pawn. In order to prevent this, black needs to play king g7. Can you remember the key Lucena move that shields white's king from checks and builds a bridge for the pawn to promote? That's right, with rook f4. So that when white's king moves to d5, the rook can shield it from checks with rook d4. Do you have what it takes to win a rook and pawn ending using the Lucena strategy? Let's see. Defending a rook and pawn versus rook ending is no easy task. It's all too easy to get pushed to the edge of the board and find yourself in a hopeless situation, just like this position. It's black's turn to move, but unfortunately for black, there is no way to save the position. Black's king does block the promotion square of the pawn, but black's rook is way too passive. If black tries to activate the rook with rook g1, hoping to start checking the king, white can simply play rook h8 with checkmate to follow. White is threatening to play rook a7 with checkmate on the next turn. If black plays king f8, the simplest way for white to win is by playing rook f7 check, forcing black's king to e8. White now threatens checkmate with rook a7, when black's position will collapse. Are all rook versus rook and pawn endings hopeless for the defender? Not at all. In fact, if you know the Philidor position, there are good chances to save this endgame. Let's take a look. Even though white is up a pawn, has a strong rook on the 7th rank, and an active king, the position is completely drawn, if black understands the Philidor position. When defending this position, you want your king to be in front of the passed pawn, blocking its path to promotion. In the first example, black's rook sat passively on the back rank. This was the key to black's defeat. The Philidor position is also known as the 3rd rank defense. The key to defending the Philidor position is by moving the rook to your 3rd rank. In this case, by playing rook g6. The black rook is activated and prevents white's king from advancing. The idea is to force white to push the pawn forward so white's king cannot move in front of the pawn. If white refuses to move the pawn and waits by playing a move such as rook a7, all you need to remember is to keep the rook on your 3rd rank until your opponent pushes the pawn forward. So black plays a waiting move, rook h6. Checking the king does not help white, so after king e4, rook g6, and king f5, white's king desperately wants the rook to leave the 6th rank so white can advance the king. Remember to keep the Philidor position simple by staying on the rank with rook b6. Checking the black king does not help as it will always stay in front of the pawn on e7 or e8. White finally decides to advance the pawn with e6. This is what black has been waiting to see. Now that the pawn is on e6, white is threatening to play king f6 and threaten checkmate. Only when the pawn advances to the same rank as the rook, and only then, black now moves the rook to white's 1st rank with rook b1. Now that the king cannot hide in front of its pawn, black's rook is prepared to attack the king with multiple checks. After king f6, rook f1 check, king e5, rook e1 check. Black's rook continues to shadow the white king with checks. After king d5, rook d1 check. If the king moves away from the pawn, such as with king c6, black's rook can continue to check the king, but the simplest move is to attack the pawn with rook e1. If white protects the pawn with the king, black's rook will keep checking the king. White cannot make any progress and the game is drawn. Since moving the king did not work, what if white tries to block the rook's checks by playing rook a4? After rook f1 check and rook f4, black can simply trade rooks with rook takes f4, king takes f4, and king e7, entering a completely drawn king and pawn ending. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, black has the option to check white's king with rook b1. Is this a good idea? After rook b1 check, king c6, white is threatening rook h8 checkmate, and black's king will have to give up its important defensive location, being on the same file as the passed pawn. Since checking the king led to serious problems for black, can you remember the key defensive idea in the Philidor position? That's right, the 3rd rank defense with rook g6. The rook is now guarding black's 3rd rank and will move back and forth on that rank until sooner or later white advances the pawn with c6. Once the pawn advances to the same rank as the rook, The rook should now move to the attacker's first rank with rook g1, preparing to deliver checks against the white king. Since white's king cannot hide in front of the passed pawn, the game is once again drawn. Now that you've learned how to save the game in a Philidor position, it's time to test your skills. Pawns don't always get the respect that they deserve. They are often captured and usually outpowered by the stronger pieces on the board. But when pawns begin to advance up the board together, they become a powerful force. Mobile pawns can be very dangerous, at times outpowering both minor and major pieces. With white to move, the position is locked up, and it looks like white will have to move the rook to safety with rook a7. But what if white could clear open a path for the advanced b and c pawns to march forward? To black's surprise, white played the powerful sacrifice rook takes c7 check. And after rook takes c7, white plays bishop takes b6. White has sacrificed an entire rook, but white's connected passed pawns are too much to handle. If black plays rook c8, moving the rook to safety, white will win after bishop takes d8, rook takes d8, and b6. White's connected pawn pair outpowers black's rook, as black will not be able to prevent one of the pawns from promoting. In the game, black played knight e6 and resigned after bishop takes c7. After knight takes c7, white's pawns will overwhelm the knight and force a promotion. Let's take a look at another example of pawns fighting against pieces. The French master Le Bourdonnais, playing the black pieces, has three powerful passed pawns dominating white's territory. Let's watch how he uses his pawns to overwhelm white's position, starting with the powerful move queen e1. Since capturing black's queen would allow checkmate after black promotes the f2 pawn, Irish master MacDonald, handling the white pieces, played rook c1. Black's queen is under serious pressure, so black supports the queen with the pawn advance d2. Black has two pawns anchoring the queen on e1, prepared to promote and capture the rooks if white dares to capture the queen. White tries to counterattack with queen c5, attacking black's rook. Black simply moves the rook to safety with rook g8. When after rook d1, black marches another pawn forward with e3. After queen c3, Black's pawns overwhelm white's defenses after the stunning queen sacrifice. Queen takes d1. And after rook takes d1, e2, white resigned as black's advanced pawns are stronger than the white queen and rook combined. Let's take a look at one more example together. Sacrificing a piece to gain a powerful pawn center can be very dangerous for an unprepared opponent. In the 4 knights opening, white can play the dangerous, but ultimately dubious, Halloween gambit with knight takes e5. After knight takes e5, white sacrifices a piece to gain a strong pawn center while pushing black's knights around. After d4, knight c6, d5, knight e5, white's pawns continue to lunge forward with f4. And after knight g6, e5. White's powerful pawn center can be very dangerous if black doesn't know how to defend against the attack. Black can keep the piece by playing knight g8, although after d6, black must know exactly how to handle this sharp position to keep an advantage. A strong move for black is bishop c5, or black can play the simple and solid bishop b4. Gaining a lead in development and allowing white to regain the piece after e takes f6 and queen takes f6. White's massive pawn attack has been broken up and black has a lot of pressure on white's position, especially against the knight on c3 and pawn on f4. Black is ready to castle on the next turn, while white has to defend weaknesses created by all of the early pawn moves. Are you ready to join the battle of pawns versus pieces? Let's put you to the test. A queen versus pawn ending is usually easily winning for the queen, but it isn't always so simple. The farther the pawn advances, the more problems the queen has to solve. The simplest way for the queen to end complications is by blocking the promotion square for the pawn. With a black pawn on the third rank, can you see how white's queen can move to the promotion square by force? If you found queen a6 check, great job. The queen checks black's king, and after it moves, white's queen blockades the promotion square with queen f1. White's king will simply march up the board and help the queen capture the pawn. If the pawn is able to make it to the second rank without the queen being able to blockade the promotion square, we enter an interesting endgame where the pawn has chances to draw. Knowing this endgame will allow you to win most positions easily, and it will also give you a chance to draw against the powerful queen. Let's take a look. In this position, black's pawn is just one move away from promoting. White must play precisely to win this endgame. The first step is to force black's king in front of the pawn, which will gain a tempo to bring white's king closer to the action. White begins the path to victory by playing queen e3 check, attacking the pawn, which forces black's king to block the promotion square with king d1. Now that black isn't threatening to promote on the next move, white brings the king closer to the pawn with king e6. Since king c1 would pin the pawn to black's king, the only way to threaten to promote the pawn is by playing king c2. White now pins the pawn to the king with queen e2. If black moves the king to c3, then white wins easily by blockading the promotion square with queen d1. This means black's only try is king c1. Since queen e3 and king c2 would be repeating moves, it is important to attack black's king with queen c4 check. Black is forced to either block the pawn with king d1 or separate the king from the pawn with king b1. White needs to force black's king in front of the pawn again, so white uses a double attack with queen d3 check, checking black's king and attacking the pawn. After king c1, white forces the king in front of the pawn again with queen c3 check. After king d1, white's king gains another tempo to move forward with king d5. After king e2, white repeats the same process. When black's king moves to the same rank as the pawn, the first step is to pin the pawn to the king with queen c2. After king e1, can you remember the important move to force black's king to either move in front of the pawn or give up its protection of the pawn? That's right, with queen e4 check. Since moving the king in front of the pawn only helps white, black's best try is to move away from the pawn with king f2. White prevents black from promoting and attacks the pawn with queen d3, forcing black to play king e1. Once again, white forces the king in front of the pawn with queen e3 check. And after king d1, king d4, king c2, now that white's king is connected with the queen, white can play queen c3 check, forcing the king in front of the pawn with king d1. When after king e3, white captures the pawn and delivers checkmate in a couple of moves. There are two situations when the side with the pawn can draw the game using a stalemate trick. If the pawn is a rook pawn, meaning a pawn on the a file or h file, and the promotion square is not blocked by the queen, the game is usually a draw. After queen b3 check, black's king blocks the pawn with king a1. But white cannot move the king closer to the action because black would be stalemated. After queen d1 check, king b2, queen d2 check, king b1, white cannot make any progress because black is either threatening to promote the pawn or will be stalemated. If the pawn is a bishop pawn, meaning a pawn on the c or f files, the side with the pawn has good drawing chances. Black is prepared to promote, and after queen b3 check, it appears black is forced to block the pawn's promotion square with the king, but black has the clever defense, king a1, abandoning the pawn because if white captures the pawn, it is stalemate. Once again, black is able to hold the balance by threatening to promote the pawn or set up a stalemate. Just because you have a rook or a bishop pawn one square away from promotion, it doesn't always mean the draw is guaranteed. If the side with the queen has a king that is close enough to the pawn, the game may still be lost. In this position, after black attempts the stalemate trick with king h1, white can win after queen f3 check. Forcing king g1, white allows black to promote after king g3, and f1 equals queen. If white's queen can move to h2, it would be checkmate. Can you see how white can force this to happen? After queen e3 check, black's queen cannot safely block the check, so after king h1, white's queen moves to the h-file with queen h6 check. Forcing checkmate after king g1, queen h2, checkmate. Now that you've learned both how to win, and at times draw the queen versus advanced pawn ending, it's time to show your endgame skills. The two bishops working together are an incredible force, dominating both the light and dark squares. Notice that black's king is locked in a diagonal prison. There is no way to escape the bishops. The two bishops are powerful, but are they strong enough to checkmate the king? With the help of the white king, the two bishops can force the king into one of the corners and deliver checkmate, like this. After bishop e6 check, black's king is forced into the corner with king h8, when white wins the game with bishop d4. Checkmate. Let's learn how the bishops and king can work together to set up this winning position. The bishops and king are all in their starting positions, and black's king is in the center of the board. But with careful play, black's king will be forced into a corner and checkmated. Since the bishops can easily move across the board, taking time to activate the king is a good plan. After king e2, black's best try is to stay in the center of the board as long as possible with king e4. But what happens if black plays king c3? After king e3, if black attacks white's bishop with king c2, after bishop d2, notice that black's king is already stuck in the corner when white will use the same ideas we'll see in the main position to checkmate black. After king e3, the only way to try and escape the corner is by playing king b4. Black hopes to move to c5, but white takes the opposition with king d4. And after king a5, king c5, black's king is forced back with king a4. When bishop d2, forces the black king toward the corner where it will be checkmated. Black's best attempt to avoid being forced into the corner is by playing king e4, staying directly in the center. White wants to prevent black's king from moving back and forth on the fourth rank and forces it backwards with bishop e3. After king e5, king d3, if black plays king f5, white will prevent the king from returning to the center with king d4. So black tries to stay in the center with king d5. How can white force the black king out of the center and make black retreat? That's right, with bishop d4. Step by step, white is pushing black's king backwards, forcing it closer and closer to the back rank. After king d6, white gains more space with king e4, controlling the center and also opening up another diagonal for the light-squared bishop. After king e6, white's light-squared bishop joins the action with bishop c4 check. Black tries to stay on the sixth rank with king d6. Can you see how white can force black's king to retreat again? That's right, with bishop d5. After king d7, white's king marches forward, taking control of more space with king e5. Black plays king c7. White improves the dark-squared bishop by playing bishop c5. The bishops working side by side greatly restrict black's king. After king d7, white is now able to force black to the back rank with bishop d6. After king d8, white needs to bring the king to one of the corner squares to deliver checkmate. Let's force the black king to h8. White begins this plan by playing bishop e6, keeping the king stuck on the back rank and preventing the king from moving to c8. After the force king e8, notice that bishop c7, preventing the king from moving to d8, allows the king to move to e7. White prevents this by playing king f6. And after king d8, what is white to do? King f7 would be stalemate, and bishop e7 would allow the king to escape the back rank with king c7. The simplest choice is to play a waiting move, such as bishop e5. Black is now forced to play king e8. By using a waiting move, white can now prevent black's king from moving to d8 and start forcing it toward the h8 square with bishop c7. After king f8, white wants to prevent black's king from moving to e8. Don't ruin all of your hard work by playing bishop f7 when the position is stalemate. How else can white prevent black from moving to e8? That's right, with bishop d7. After king g8, black hopes to move off the back rank with king h7 on the next turn. Let's keep our king active and keep black's king on the back rank with king g6. Black now has a choice, f8 or h8. If king f8, black is trying to escape with king e7, but this is easily stopped with bishop d6 check, forcing the king toward the corner with king g8. And after bishop e6 check, king h8, the king is checkmated after bishop e5. Checkmate. If instead of king f8, what if black tries to play king h8? Watch out for bishop e6, stalemate. White should restrict black's king by playing bishop d6. Now the king cannot escape the corner of the board. After king g8, the king hunt ends after bishop e6 check, forcing king h8, and bishop e5. Checkmate. Are you ready to force checkmate with the two bishops? Let's see.